I'm going to guess you've heard this song before. I've Been Everywhere, the clever, comic, rambling, auctioneer-style hobo song which went to number one for Hank Snow in 1962 when he released his version. Clarence Eugene Snow was born May 9, 1914 in Brooklyn, not the sprawling Brooklyn, New York, but the tiny hamlet of Brooklyn, Nova Scotia in the Maritimes of Canada. Peering into the world of this young boy helps us to appreciate just how pioneering he would be. The product of a remote fishing village near the beginning of World War I, he would miraculously be destined for international stardom. Clarence would go from hawking cod tongues by the fishing wharf all the way to the Grand Ole Opry, and even discover the king of rock and roll. Rural Nova Scotia in the beginning of the 20th century had none of the amenities we take for granted now. Brooklyn, hours by gravel road to the nearest city of Halifax, was once known as Herring Cove, its older name hinting at the community's connection to the broad Atlantic Ocean beside which it lay. Those cold North Atlantic waters would one day nearly take young Snow's life, playing a significant role in forming his resolve to pursue his dream as a musician, a career that would ultimately span more than 50 years, during that time recording 140 records, of which I own about a third. I'm always scouring thrift shops and used record stores for new, old Hank Snow treasures, and I routinely hear music from him that is new to my ears. His parents were married in 1909 in Liverpool, Nova Scotia, and scrawny little Clarence was born to George and his wife Maud in Brooklyn, the two villages just across from each other where the Mersey River meets the ocean. Clarence was the fifth of 6 children. His 2 eldest siblings died as babies. Those were harsh times in economically depressed remote communities, and death in infancy was not uncommon. In his autobiography, Snow tells how his parents struggled to feed their 4 children, but notes with some pride that both parents had musical talent, although Snow wrote his father sang, quote, in an amateurish way. His mother, on the other hand, was an accomplished singer, who also played piano during silent films at the local theater and for minstrel shows. At only 8 years old, his parents separated, and an organization called the Overseer of the Poor decided he and his siblings should be taken from their mother, as she was deemed incapable of caring for 4 kids on her own. Surely a heartbreaking prospect for little Clarence and the others. The siblings were separated and sent to different caregivers, that early life upheaval for little Snow made even worse by the fact he was awarded to his cruel paternal grandmother, but at least remaining in Brooklyn and near his mom. His grandmother, though, treated him with vindictiveness about his mother leaving his father, ordering Clarence never to speak of her, enforcing that rule with beatings and abuse. He missed his mother, naturally, we know, as he describes in his book The Torment of Those Days, but mercifully, she was only a few miles away in neighboring Liverpool, so he would sneak away when he could to see her, making what would have seemed a long walk for a child, driven by his longing for his mom's love, dauntless against the despair of knowing the punishments awaiting him from his grandmother when he returned. To discipline him for sneaking away, the old woman tried to have Clarence sent to reform school, but the deciding council instead allowed him to finally return to his mother. Imagine how that little boy's heart must have swelled to be reunited. You can sense the glow of admiration in his writing when he describes a Hawaiian steel guitar his mom purchased from a magazine advertisement, surely a luxury in those impoverished times. She at first did not let Clarence touch her prized possession, but when she finally did let him play, he evidently had been paying attention to her and was able to create for himself what she described as beautiful sounds. He had an ear for music. He learned the basic chords in his first few songs, and soon word got around of his singing and playing abilities. In those days, people made their own entertainment, and Clarence was soon playing almost every night for families in the villages, honing his chops. Back then, a child would be expected to contribute to the family's welfare as soon as possible. So at just 12 years old, Clarence joined the crew of a fishing schooner, where he served as a cabin boy. The job itself earned him no pay, but he was allowed to cut out the tongues of the cod and sell them along with any fish he caught from on deck. After one successful trip, he sold his tongues and fish for a whopping $58. Thrilled to have earned what was a good amount of money for those days, he did what any budding young musician would want to do. He purchased a mail-order guitar and a chord book from the Eaton's catalog, all for the princely sum of $5.95, finally getting himself his own instrument. Working on the fishing boat, he heard crackly radio broadcasts while at sea, music by the country artists of the time, songs like The Wreck of Old 97. He describes in his book how they gave him a great lift. It must have been an incredible revelation to his young ears, and he tried to learn and sing those songs exactly correct, a meticulous player right from the beginning, entertaining his fellow crew members, their enthusiasm to his renditions bolstering his growing adolescent interest in music. He couldn't have known while he and his crew bobbed on the wild North Atlantic that many of those songs he would eventually go on to record himself as part of an illustrious music career. Clarence worked in fishing until the summer of 1930, about 4.5 years. Most Nova Scotian men would spend their lives plying a living from those waters, but an event happened that changed the course of Clarence's life. The schooner he was sailing on was caught in a ferocious gale, blowing he and his mates towards Sable Island, known also as the Graveyard of the Atlantic, as many a sailor had perished on those hidden shoals far out to sea. About 14 miles from the island, he describes in his book how, to quote, "the good Lord reached out his hand and changed the wind," adding that they were saved by the grace of God, a spiritualism he maintained and would sing about throughout his life. Somehow his boat was spared the same dreadful fate of 6 others lost in the storm, 132 men swallowed by the sea. Later, safely ashore and no doubt mortified, he vowed he would never again return to the open ocean. Maritime industry, though, was of course mostly centered around fishing, so Clarence was left to seek odd jobs on land, and always nothing seemed to last or pay enough. One day he spotted a nicer guitar in another Eaton's catalog, this one an exorbitant $12.95, and eventually, with a little good luck and some hard work and selling his old guitar, he put together enough to order the new one. A better instrument, Snow began playing in the style of Jimmie Rogers, his musical hero. Still singing and playing for the locals, he was invited to perform for a fundraising charity show in Bridgewater, Nova Scotia. It was there he had his first true public performance, his debut, which was, as he called it, a big success, adding, "I even got a standing ovation." Imagine that teenager's spark of inspiration from that little success. Growing confident in his skills, 18-year-old Snow wrote to the Halifax radio station CHNX asking for an audition, they replying with a rejection letter, but it making him more determined. The enthusiasm from his audiences was infectious, and he believed in himself. After more practicing, he made the long journey to the province's capital to visit the radio station in person and ask for an audition. In those days, a musician could just walk into a station and try to impress enough for airtime. Well, they hired him to do a Saturday evening show, what must have seemed a tremendous breakthrough, now finally able to leave his fishing village and live in the city of Halifax. First advertised as Clarence Snow and his guitar, he was already intuitive about branding himself, and next adopted the name the Cowboy Blue Yodeler, in homage to his idol Jimmie Rogers. His radio show didn't have a sponsor, therefore he wasn't paid for his performances, but people hearing him on the radio hired him to play in halls and clubs across the city and in surrounding towns where he otherwise might not have been heard. And he describes in his book the long trips on the harrowing gravel backroads of Nova Scotia, traveling to and from gigs, crashing his car one treacherous night, hurt but undaunted. He also played in Halifax theaters before movies started, and eventually on a CHNS radio show that was sponsored by a laxative company of all things, but earning now a steady $10 a week, livable money in those days. To be earning a living as a musician at all as the Great Depression loomed was a real testament to his talent and drive. The radio station's chief engineer and announcer encouraged Clarence to adopt the name Hank because it went well with his cowboy song repertoire, So he was again influenced by his idol Jimmie Rogers, again rebranding, becoming Hank the Yodeling Ranger. Hank Snow. Was there ever a more Canadian-sounding name for a country musician? Yodeling was a popular element to early country music, and Smallish Hank was very good at it. Some of his early recordings show us his skill. Through tireless gigs and dedication to his radio program, growing in notoriety provincially, Snow would eventually appear on CBC's radio network. He was breaking out. In September 1935, at 21, Hank Snow married a young woman from a local chocolate factory, her name Minnie, she becoming his wife for life. She soon became pregnant and gave birth to, surprisingly, their only son, named Jimmie Rogers Snow, another nod to Hank's hero. I can't say for sure why they only had one child in those days, when larger families were the norm, but perhaps it was because of his dedication to his craft that he kept his family small, so he could focus on his career. As by now, Hank Snow felt strongly about his destiny to become a successful recording artist. He decided it was time to take the long train ride to Montreal, Quebec, and go to the Canadian division of RCA Victor, where he auditioned for a chance to cut a record. Evidently, they liked what they heard, because on October 29, 1936, Hank Snow signed his first recording contract, not knowing then he'd go on to spend 5 decades recording for RCA Victor, his entire career. Soon, a weekly CBC radio show that was broadcast across Canada introduced him to a national audience, and he began touring to meet the demand for his music across the vast country. In the late 1940s, American country music stations also began playing his records, opening him up to the much bigger U.S. audience. North America had become his stage. His unlikely dream was realized, and his career solidified. Hank Snow moved his little family to the heart of country music near Nashville, Tennessee in 1949, purchasing what he called the Rainbow Ranch, and modified his persona yet again into Hank Snow, the Singing Ranger, the name that would stick and become his truest musical personality. Then making his first records for RCA Victor USA that same year. His first U.S. release, called Marriage Vow, reached a respectable number 10 on the country charts in the fall of '49. Then in early 1950, Hank Snow released what would become his first of 7 number 1 hits. I'm Moving On topped the charts for 21 weeks, holding the record for most weeks at number 1 for quite a long time. I'm Moving On burst him into the American music scene, this at the time when television was first entering common living rooms. The impact of seeing him sing his popular songs right there in one's home was enormous. It's an experience we take for granted now. He was pioneering both in music and television and becoming a household name in the process. An invitation to the Grand Ole Opry landed him in the epicenter of the country music universe, and audiences there grew to love him once they became familiar with his unique style. Becoming very confident in himself now, in his mastery of the guitar, in his prowess in the recording studio, in his professionalism, in his management and stage presence, in his position of prominence in the country music scene, it would be fair to say that Hank had become somewhat haughty about himself. Deservedly so, I'd argue, considering where he'd come from and where he'd brought himself. Hank Snow had every right to be proud of his achievements. He was a demanding professional and expected the same from those working for him. That same year, 2 more songs hit number 1, The Golden Rocket and Rhumba Boogie. 1950 changed his life forever. The boy from the fishing village was now a superstar. A regular at the Opry, it was Hank Snow who persuaded directors there to allow a young Elvis Presley to appear on stage in 1954. Elvis, amazingly, was Hank Snow's opening act at the time. He entered into partnership to manage the obviously destined Elvis with a wily fella named Colonel Tom Parker, who almost immediately squeezed Hank Snow out of the arrangement. Elvis's meteoric rise was too great a prize for the devious Parker to share, an act that cost Tom Parker Hank's respect for life. He would never refer to him again as the Colonel out of spite. But Hank Snow was doing very well in his own right, delighting audiences with his seasoned performances while dressed in flashy studded suits. he would enjoy a 6 decades long career while selling more than 80 million albums. Prolific, he wrote many of his own songs, plus he was a masterful interpreter of covers, like I've Been Everywhere, which he took to #1. Hank Snow became an American citizen in 1958, but always acknowledged his roots, one of his later records being called My Nova Scotia Home. His unlikely journey and good fortune, I'm sure, were not lost upon him. He would be elected to the Nashville Songwriters Hall of Fame, the Country Music Hall of Fame in both Canada and America, the Canadian Music Hall of Fame, and the Nova Scotia Music Hall of Fame. 10 times, Hank Snow was voted Canada's top country music performer. His 7th and final #1 hit, Hello Love, would chart in April 1974 when he was a month shy of 60, the oldest country artist to have a song top the charts at the time, a record he'd hold for 26 years. His autobiography, The Hank Snow Story, was published in 1994. Hank Snow retired from performing in 1996 following respiratory problems and memory decline. His son Jimmy described in an interview how his dad could no longer remember the words to songs he had sang for 50 years. He also described how stern his father could be, how once he made Jimmy wear a dress on stage to shame him after he got mud on his good clothes. Hank had a heavy-handed professionalism that demanded perfect behavior from Jimmy, as well as top musicianship and commitment from his band. Hank Snow would die of heart failure at his beloved Rainbow Ranch in 1999, aged 85. His wife Minnie, with him until the end, would pass a few years later in 2003. My connections to Hank Snow are second-hand at best, but still interesting. As one that specializes in concerts for senior living, many times I've enjoyed hearing personal tales about Hank from people that had known him. I met a lady that claimed to have babysat little Jimmy. I had another tell me that Clarence sang at their house long before he made it big. And more than one made it clear that he was a hard-nosed, determined young man in those early difficult years. He could hold his drink, and times would get wildly festive when he played and sang, but it was clear Hank already had a professional attitude even at a young age. I myself didn't grow up listening to Hank Snow other than perhaps seeing him on television from time to time, but my siblings and I recall with some humor how our German-speaking grandfather called him Hank Schnee. But I was certainly introduced to him time and again by my senior audiences, from whom I take requests. And once I discovered Hank's incredible musicianship and beautiful baritone voice, I became a true fan and now collector of his records. I hope to review some of his albums in future videos. As my career as a touring musician took me repeatedly to Nova Scotia, where Hank was from, I eventually scheduled myself to visit to the Hank Snow Hometown Museum and the old train station in Liverpool. While visiting, I inquired about their annual tribute festival and was grateful to be hired to perform a set the following season. I was unknown to that audience, but I was well prepared, and I think I played more Hank Snow than any of the other performers, those that I heard anyway, satisfying the crowd with my cover songs and gaining their applause. A gracious crowd. It was a great feeling to win them over. This one of my favorite touring memories. I played some top hits and some personal favorites, including an obscure song called I Knew That We'd Meet Again. That song impressed one old fella enough that he came and sat beside me at my fruitless merch table. For half an hour we leaned into each other's ears, straining to talk as he flipped through his thick binder of memorabilia until he found reference to that old song. And his kind gesture was my sweet reward for that performance. Thank you, sir. To this day, I love singing the songs of Hank Snow, one of Canada's music pioneers. He from a time where music and history meet.